Hello everyone, this is Dr. Supriya Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to Banaras Hindu University. I welcome you to the lecture 2 of week 4. The title of the course is Understanding Deconstruction, a Critical Approach, and the title of this particular lecture is A Deconstructive Reading of Mahasweta Devi's Breast Giver and Draupadi. So here in this particular lecture, we would be dealing with these two short stories. As we know that Mahasweta Devi is an activist, an Indian writer who often wrote and worked with tribals and the marginalized people. And here these two stories basically deals with the defiance of such marginalized women who can be considered as a woman in the fourth world according to Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak. So Spivak has also done a rereading of her stories where she found that perhaps there is no space from where these women can speak, and when we are speaking for them, we are perhaps filtering the things and therefore we cannot express them completely. And when they speak, they are not getting any space to present themselves, and even if they are speaking, we are not able to hear them, or they are not heard in this particular social system because it is suppressing their voices. So now let us come to the lecture. Here we see that Mahasweta Devi, who was born in the year 1926 and died in the year 2016, was a prolific Indian writer, activist, and social reformer, known for her powerful literary work that gave voice to the marginalized and oppressed, especially tribal communities in India. Her writings blend fiction, reportage, and political critique, and they often center on themes of social injustice, class struggle, gender discrimination, and resistance. She chronicled the lives of many Indian Adivasis, tribal people, women, Dalits, and landless laborers, exposing the systems that oppress them. Her fiction is a form of protest literature, one can say. Many of her stories feature strong, defiant female protagonists, and the present lecture is a discussion on such women as to how they speak in a system which does not give them a space to speak, and even if they manage to speak somehow, they are not heard. So ultimately, they speak through their bodies. Mahasweta Devi's works are not just literary texts, rather, they are documents of resistance this way and testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systemic injustice. Now, this lecture will deal with two short stories of Mahasweta Devi, Breast Giver and Draupadi. Mahasweta Devi's Breast Giver basically follows Jashoda, the heroine or the protagonist of this particular story, who is a poor Brahmin who becomes a professional vet nurse to support her husband as well as her family. She breastfeeds dozens of upper class children, and because of this, over time, her body is exhausted and her breasts become hard and economically useless, you can say. And similarly, her own identity becomes worthless in the eyes of all for whom she was feeding their children, as well as for whom she was a wage earner. And ultimately, we find that in the end of the story, she dies of breast cancer, symbolizing how the selfless, nurturing woman is used and abandoned by the very society she sustains. And in the end, in spite of having so many milk children, so many self children, she was cremated by an untouchable. This is a poignant short story written originally in Bengali as Standaini in 1997 by Mahasweta Devi. Now, when we come to the surface reading of Breast Giver, we find that it appears to be a poignant female tale, a feminist tale, about the woman Jashoda, a woman who becomes a professional wet nurse to support her husband and family, ultimately sacrificing her body and life. A traditional reading might see this story as a martyr figure, a story of a martyr figure, or we can see Jashoda as a metaphor for Mother India or a universal mother who gives endlessly and is exploited in the process. Now, when we come to the deconstructive reading of this particular story, we find that it challenges this coherence which apparently is visible. It focuses instead on textual contradictions, slippages, and paradoxes that reveal deeper instability in meaning. Now, we can see first as the binary of giver versus receiver, where we find that Jashoda seems to be the giver at first because of the title. So, the title indicates she is the breast giver or she is the giver, and here she seems to be this way in the dominant position where she can give at least. Now, this deals with the superficial story, a story where she seems to be giver at a wider level. However, when we go deeper into the story, when we look at it delicately, the story gradually exposes how this act of giving is not autonomous, rather, it is used, commodified, and exploited because she was compelled to produce. It narrates the real life story and not this just a wider perspective of the overall story. Now, her giving here can be seen as one that was demanded, not freely offered. Thus, the title becomes ironic, and she, though seems to be a giver, is actually a producer. She is actually a product who was sold in the gradual course of the story. Thus, the binary gets overturned as a receiver dominantly consumes and shapes her identity, and she gives not out of choice but out of necessity. Now, she can also be seen as a binary of mother versus machine, where her name Jashoda can be seen as a pun on Yashoda, the mother of Krishna, and hence she is mythologized as a universal mother, evoking maternal ideals. However, over time, her body is industrialized. She becomes a milk machine, one that the families use and discard. Her breast, once sacred, becomes a site of industrialized labor and mechanical machine pain, and that ultimately gets diseased. Now, this way, we also find that we can see a binary between sacrifice and exploitation. So, here, though she sacrifices, but she can be seen as exploited. And one can see her as a heroic, self sacrificing figure, but instead of that, she remains unheroic, where neither her husband and children nor her milk children show any affection, and she is abandoned to die in the end. Now, here it can be read in the light of Spivak's A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, so as to interrogate how major philosophical ideas like Marxism, often seen as progressive or liberatory, participate in epistemic violence as it fails to account for women's domestic or reproductive labor. However, her case study surpasses such philosophical isms as it goes against the idea that women's reproductive labor is unpaid. It is therefore not just a story of feminism, rather a sight of doubly marginalized gender role entangled in the fourth world, a mere commodity, a rare piece of case study. So here, actually, Spivak in her writing in her book A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason tries to interrogate that how major philosophies or major ideas like Marxism fail to explore the little meaner issues which are quite unique in the life of such marginalized women, and therefore they cannot claim for all women. They cannot claim for some universalized kind of theory or ideas, because when Marxist theory comes with an interpretation that women's reproductive labor is unpaid, here we find that Jashoda is a woman who is selling her body, who is producing through her body, who is earning through her body, and she is getting wages in place. Now, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, in her seminal essay Can the Subaltern Speak, questions whether the structurally oppressed subaltern can ever truly speak in systems designed to silence them. So, here she questions the system. Spivak, through Can the Subaltern Speak, questions the system, a system which is not meant for such marginalized women because they do not get space to speak for their personal issues, to speak or to assert for their sufferings, because they do not have space to express them. And even if they are expressing, even if they are speaking, they are not heard. Now, in her interpretation, we find now that Jashoda's labor feeds many, but her story is told by others, and her death is a kind of a mute erasure. According to Spivak, even the narrator, while narrator here she is addressing Mahasweta Devi, saying that even the narrator, while sympathetic towards um, towards Jashoda, is embedded in the very structure that she unknowingly commodifies her. So this way, Jashoda cannot speak in any meaningful way because she is written into a patriarchal, casteist, capitalist narrative that only uses her but does not ever allow her to represent herself. Her voice is not heard. She is representing all marginalized women this way, whose concerns are so different that even any bigger ism or philosophy are fail to accommodate them. Now, here we can also see the text in the light of Judith Butler's idea, where she considers body as text. We can see that how Jashoda's body becomes, according to Judith Butler, a site of writing where her milk, pain, scars, and cancer are inscriptions of social power, caste, class, and gender. And similarly, we come to understand that how, when she gives her theory of gender performativity, she argues that gender isn't something we are, but something we do. It believes in performance that is repeated over time. It is something that is not innate but constructed. And this way, she performs an ideal feminine, a mother. We can see Jashoda as a mother figure, a universal mother, an ideal feminine who feeds not her children properly, but who delivers to feed others' children, and so as to be a wage earner. Thus, her identity gets blurred between a wage earner and a mother who sacrifices the milk of her children to provide for others. Her identity gets complicated between a father, because she is an earning member, so she can also be considered as a father figure in the family. So her identity moves or shifts between a range. So she can be a father, she can be a mother who is continuously delivering a child for the production of milk, but she is not feeding them properly, and rather she is feeding the others, the other children, and therefore she can be considered as a seller, a producer, a machine, or an industry. So she ranges. There is no binary, rather, in between spaces where she blurs the binary through the performances that she is doing. Now, coming to another story, here the two stories are connected because we find that how she is perhaps writing a text. Her body is actually a site where she has wrote her milk, her pain, her cancerous disease, and the sufferings. So, in another story, Draupadi, we find that The protagonist speaks through her body, she confronts through her body, and in this way, she tries to face the patriarchal structure, the system, and the corruption that is pervaded all over. So, a single woman, how she confronts speaking through her body, and there also we would take recourse to the intertextuality where Laugh of Medusa of Helen Shuko comes in a way that is quite terrifying. Now, Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi tells the story of Dopti Mejan. Actually, it is a story written by Mahasweta Devi in Bengali, and there the protagonist has been named as Dopti Mejan, a tribal woman and an Naxalite who is captured, tortured, and further raped by the state police. However, in a powerful act of defiance, she refuses to clothe herself when summoned by the officer the next morning, using her naked, wounded body as a form of resistance. The story thus reimagines the epic Draupadi. And here, as soon as we use or see the name Draupadi, we are at once get evoked with the epical Draupadi, and at once this subverts the narrative of the epic. Now, coming to the epical Draupadi and a comparison and a deconstructive reading of this particular Draupadi, we see that the epical Draupadi was actually saved by Lord Krishna to set the binary of dharma and adharma. So there at that particular point of time, we see that Lord Krishna come to save Draupadi in Mahabharata, where he sets a binary between dharma and adharma. However, here this binary gets dismantled under the modern social setup, where state police representing as a savior overturns the binary, and again a tale of victimhood turned into one who goes for fearless confrontation against oppression. The story here is also translated and analyzed by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. As Spivak has translated and edited the versions of Mahasweta Devi's stories, three stories basically, which are considered as breast stories. And Mahasweta Devi's breast giver and Draupadi are two of the stories which we have taken from that also. Now, the original Bengali version of Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi is named Dobdi Mejan, particularly because it is a localized, tribalized, distorted form of Draupadi, and or you can say that this shift has been deliberate or political. Now, emphasizing Draupadi's tribal identity can also be one of the idea, so that we can distance her relationship from the elite, classical, mythical Draupadi, who is queen in contrast to a mere tribal subaltern Dobdi. However, both of them are, though different, they are treated almost always in a similar way in the patriarchal structure of the society. Thus, for Spivak, the reuse of the name Draupadi at once evokes and subverts the epic narrative. And unlike the epic, no divine intervention comes up to save her. Where myth cannot protect the marginalized women in the real world oppression, in the modern world full of corruption. So, this way, the symbolic weight of Draupadi becomes hollow in the face of sexual violence from the side of the saving agency. Now, coming to another binary, we see that Draupadi is here raped in custody, a very horrific act of the state violence. But in the final scene, she reverts the binary, she again turns up the binary. She, though she is a victim, and she here behaves in such a manner that the binary gets reverted, it becomes victim versus agent. And here, in the final scene, when she stands naked, refusing to clothe herself before the officer, she reclaims agency through her body. Her statement, What's the use of clothes? You can strip me, but how can you clothe me again? Becomes an act of radical defiance. The binary of agent oblique victim or par oblique victim collapses completely. Dopty's par emerges from parlessness, though she is raped, but she is refused to be ashamed, suppressing the male gaze. And this way, she again subverts the binary of silence oblique speech. Here, through her silence, she is able to speak through her body. And throughout the story, we see that she was spoken about by the state, by Sena Nayak, her hunter. But in the final scene, she speaks for herself, not with a weapon, but with her body and her refusal again. The binary this way again gets unstable, and it can be seen in the light of Helen Shiko, again, the laugh of Medusa, where we see Draupadi rode through her body. She rides through her body in the absence of voice, in the absence of autonomy or narrative space. Like Bertha Mason, Draupadi does not speak as women like her do not get space actually to speak, and even if they will speak, they will not be heard. Rather, it is only their body that becomes a site of expression, resistance, and protest. Her refusal to be clothed is actually a non verbal scream, a resistance without using language, challenging the idea that language is the only valid form of speech. This defiance is therefore unreadable to the state. Sena Nayak becomes paralyzed, confused, unable to understand this confrontation. And this way we can also see here it or the story in the light of Judith Butler's gender performativity. It becomes a narrative where identity gets blurred, and hence Dobdi refuses to perform the role of a violated, shamed woman. She turns the objectification into subjectivity, violation into weapon. And this way go we can understand that how the two stories can be interpreted in a different way, and it go on to explore more and more meanings. Not only these two stories, but we have also Dolati the Bountiful, though we have not discussed here it in this particular lecture because of the time constraint. But we see that here also there is a girl, Dolati. Dolati the Bountiful is the title of the story, and you should read it. Here, Dolati is one who is paying the debt of her father through her body, and she was compelled to go with sexual relationships with other men. She is acting as a prostitute only to pay off the debt taken by her father. And ultimately, while in the end her body becomes diseased, she escapes from the prostitute house, and she falls upon a map of India which was drawn on the ground in order to celebrate Independence Day in a school. And this way, she sprawled across the whole map, telling the story or telling the narrative that these women are always subaltern, and they are not able to speak even after so many years of independence, and their situation or position is almost the same. Thank you.